godless basis of the single market. I sort of set myself this title, first of all, with slightly in tongue-in-cheek. But as I prepared for this, I've felt that actually it's not an unjustifiable title at all. If you will bear with me, I'm going to begin by reading from the Gospel of Matthew, because what I have to say, I hope, is based on biblical principles and my Christian faith. And were you to have a Bible with you, if you turn to Matthew 25 and from verse 14. Jesus is speaking and he says, "For the kingdom of God kingdom of heaven is just like a man about to go on a journey who calls his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner the one who had received 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you entrusted me 5 to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Also, the one who had received 2 talents came up and said, 'Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've gained 2 more talents.' And his master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one who had also received 1 talent came up and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours.' But his master answered and said to him, 'You wicked, lazy servant. You knew I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But for the one who does not have, even what he does shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless servant into outer darkness, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" Ooh, how politically incorrect. Now, I know parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings, but I do want to make use of that story and many others that Jesus told. I worked out about half of his parables have to do with economics. This was a classic case in point. One can think of many others if you run your mind through them. But interestingly, the word economics is a biblical word, oikonomia, household management, household administration, and in the New Testament it's developed to be God's household management of his world and his people and our salvation and its creation. It's also about our training in holiness. I think perhaps as Christians we tend to take a slightly standoff view on matters of economics and matters of trade and creation of wealth. There are Bible passages that indeed warn us about this, or warn us to be careful, rightly so. "If riches increase, set not your heart upon them," Psalm 62. Or 1 John when he writes, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boastings of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever." And yet, and this is not to dismiss that, quite the reverse. I want that to be underneath all that I am saying. But nonetheless, we do need to tackle the issue of wealth creation, the market. When Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, it proved something of a revolution, indeed a bit of a revelation to a lot of people, in understanding how it was human beings created wealth one for another. Not, of course, that what he said in itself was new, but his exposition of it was clear. and perhaps turned what had seemed to many people a rather mysterious art into something a lot clearer. Incidentally, if you are interested in Adam Smith, the Adam Smith Institute has a truncated version. His original book was 800 pages long. When I say clear, if you took the time, it was clear. But this is a sort of 90-page summary by Eamon Butler, which I do commend to you. You can get it down their website. There's details on the book list that will be amongst you there. Now, as Adam Smith is not now available for comment, I can make some suggestions that I think much of what he wrote and thought was moulded by biblical input. He was a Scottish person, as far as I remember. I think he's based in Edinburgh, an intellectual. What? Five. Shock horror. I beg your pardon, sir. Thank you for reminding me. But like any Scotsman, he would have known his Bible. As I said, he was not available for comment. But I think what he wrote, and what others had already prepared before him, and of some of whom were written afterwards, came from an understanding of Christianity in general. Bishop Michael has already talked about the very undergirding of British society with Christian principles. I, in fact, I think it would have been impossible for Adam Smith to write his work if there had been no Christianity in Britain and perhaps the additional impetus of the Reformation. Nor would the Western world have developed as it has done without it, without Christianity. That is, economically and scientifically and technologically. China and India had equal intelligence and equal ability to discover things, but they never did. Something stopped them, and I'm afraid the answer was their religions and their philosophies. It was because Christianity is based, strengthened by the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, that Christianity is rational in the sense that it is explainable. We have theology, we have ways of understanding the Scriptures, and the Scriptures themselves hang together with a wonderful sense of reason. This extraordinary economic liberation that the West has experienced was possible. Islam never achieved it. I know that some say there was a golden age of Islam in the 11th and 12th century. I would hint, but I can't be certain, that it was not because of Islam, but despite it. The great civilizations that we refer back to, Egypt, Greece, China, India, Rome, all failed to progress in true science and in true economics, as opposed to empirical engineering. We often think Greece gave us science. Actually, they didn't. They gave us some maths, they certainly gave us some insights, but the scientific endeavor was not a Greek idea. The very introduction of Greek philosophy at the time of the Reformation and before, as it filtered through with the conquests of Islam, actually held science back. Aristotle and other philosophers of his kind held true science back because they were asking the wrong questions. They kept on asking, why does something work, instead of how does it work? If you ask why, you're shortly off with the fairies if you're not very careful. Even democracy, and Bishop Michael touched on this, which supposedly came to us from Athens, was in Athens a chaotic and dismal failure. Christianity, in the creativity given to man by God, gives dignity, as Michael has already said, to people, to work, and to the requirement to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. This gives us the basis for freedom, because we want to choose that others should be like ourselves, and the right to choose and the right of private property. If time permitted, which it does not, I would love to explore the fascinating economic ideas we can find even in the Old Testament. I would touch briefly on the Jubilee, where all debts were remitted every 7 times 7 years. All property was returned to the original families, independent of whether it had been sold or what had happened to it. This removal of debt. That's a separate issue. It happens anyway. They're called crashes now because we don't do it voluntarily. But it does happen. Get my glasses. Sprint. It is the fundamental logos that is behind the incredible explosion of both Western technology and science and Western prosperity, which in turn provided this fuel to continue to expand. And remember, the Logos became a human being, as we're told by the Gospel in John. Now, I'm not saying things that many far greater minds than mine have not said long before me many times. But I instance, for example, Friedrich Hayek, an Australian economist, and he too said Christianity was the root of free market economics. Hayek was right, incidentally, I believe, in his economics, whereas Maynard Keynes was and is wrong. Incidentally, it's rather worrying that the latest president of the American Federal Bank is a Keynesian. Keynesian's famous quip, "In the long run, we're all dead," hints at the utilitarianism that Michael referred to, and I will say it in this company, showed he also did not care about his descendants because he had none, for the simple reason, I'm sorry to tell you, that he was a homosexual, known in Cambridge, if you'll forgive me, as the Queen of Kings. True. The explosion of wealth, not only in the West initially, but amongst the BRICS, you know what I mean by those, if I use that as the acronym, Brazil, etc., Russia, India, China, is because they actually embrace the Christian West's idea of science and economics, just as the West is abandoning them. I would instance for you Hong Kong. In the 50s, Hong Kong was a shanty island in terrible poverty, riddled with crime, drugs, and misery. An Englishman, John Cooperthwaite, who was, don't fall down dead, a civil servant, was sent out there in the 1950s to act as, in effect, the governor. Not the governor titular, but the man actually in charge. He was an unusual man. It said that he slept with a copy of Adam Smith under his pillow. And the remarkable explosion of wealth that is Hong Kong was due entirely to John Cooperthwaite's deciding to let Adam Smith's principles work in Hong Kong. And they did work. And now it is his bust, not Mao Zedong's bust, that sits in Chinese boardrooms today. John Cooperthwaite. I'll come back to that right at the end. Margaret Thatcher, who was, whatever you may think of her, a very remarkable lady, made an address to the assembly, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. There are copies of that sermon actually at the back, and I call it a sermon because it jolly well was. And I'm going to quote a few bits from it. Here is her speaking. "What then are the distinctive marks of Christianity? They stem not from social, but from the spiritual side of our lives. And personally, I would identify three beliefs in particular. First, that from the beginning, man has been endowed by God with the fundamental right to choose between good and evil. And second, that we were made in God's own image, and therefore we are expected to use all our power of thought and judgment in exercising that choice. And further, that if we open our hearts to God, he has promised to work within us. And third, that our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, when faced with his terrible choice and lonely vigil, chose to lay down his life that our sins may be forgiven." I'm continuing. "I remember very well a sermon on an Armistice Sunday when our preacher said, 'No one took away the life of Jesus, he chose to lay it down.' And I think back," she says, "to many discussions in my early life when we all agreed that if you try to take the fruits of Christianity without its roots, the fruits will wither, and they will not come again unless you nurture the roots. We are told we must work and use our talents and create wealth." I'm still quoting Mrs. Thatcher here. All the good bits will be. "If a man will not work, he shall not eat," wrote St. Paul. By the way, just to say, Paul doesn't say if a man cannot work, he shall not eat. If he will not work, it's a different question. Indeed, abundance, rather than poverty, has a legitimacy which derives from the very nature of creation. God blessed it, be fruitful and to multiply. I'm putting that in as a quote. Nevertheless, she says, the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, recognizes that making money and owning things could become selfish activities. But it is not the creation of wealth that is wrong, but love of money for its own sake. The spiritual dimension comes in deciding what one does with the wealth. How could we respond to the many calls for help, or invest for the future, or support wonderful artists and craftsmen whose work also glorifies God, unless we had first worked hard and used our talents to create the necessary wealth? That's Mrs. Thatcher. Now I'm going back to myself again. The parable of the talents that I read at the beginning does in fact sum up so much of what Adam Smith understood about economics. That trade and creating wealth is not evil. It is creative. Not just in creating wealth, good prosperity, but in creating ideas. As soon as you start trading, you don't just trade goods, you start trading ideas about goods, what to do, how to do them. Matt Ridley, now Viscount Ridley, rather neatly expressed it in a book he wrote called The Rational Optimist. I've got copies of that at the back. And if you'll forgive his slightly succinct way of putting it, he says, ideas have sex. They reproduce and multiply and produce variety. It's a lovely idea, actually, and if you read his book, it's a wonderful read. There is just one point I would make as a proviso. And I know Matt a little, and I hope he wouldn't mind me saying this. Matt doesn't grasp the initial conundrum. Where did these ideas come from in the first place? In the beginning was the Word. Secondly, Adam Smith realized, as many others have done without realizing it, money is in itself not wealth. It's useless if hoarded. Remember the parable of the talents. He hid it. Look what happened to him. It's useless if hoarded. Its use, as we know, is to lubricate creative wealth creation. As a result, wealth increases for both the producer and the buyer. Witness, on the other hand, the uselessness of the Spanish conquest of America, simply to ship back silver and gold to the continent, believing that this created wealth. It did no such thing. All it does is to devalue the value of gold and silver. For a little outtake for people of a certain generation with slightly weird tastes, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Do I get a nod? A few? Just a little sort of summarization. Some of you may remember, near the end of the first series, the B-arc of the Golga Frincham escape from their planet. The B-arc crash lands on the Earth, which at the time happens to be deserted. And being filled with middle management men, advertising executives, telephone sanitizers, and hairdressers, they have no idea about generating wealth. Instead, they decide to use leaves as currency and find that they have all become extremely rich, except for a minor matter of leaf inflation, whereby it requires one whole deciduous forest to buy one ship's peanut. So, to restore fiscal probity, they decide to burn down all the forests. Bless Douglas Adams. He had a way of putting things, didn't he? As Margaret Thatcher reminds us, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. The key to wealth, strangely, is not to seek it, but instead to work and produce goods or services and exchange goods or services that people need. Again, this is a slightly sort of material aspect of seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. If you go for the shortcut, you will have disaster. Yet, and I speak as one, the Church of England has rather often held what I call the old aristocratic, squirarchic view of wealth or wealth creation. That is trade. That it's a rather demeaning occupation. I don't perhaps think many of the hierarchy realize this, but I think they are still in that tradition. As they used to say in those novels by Trollope and others, my dear, he's in trade, definitely not one of us. And those of you who remember, yes, Prime Minister and the appointment of the bishop, that one of the candidates put to the Prime Minister was told that he has a very suitable wife. Oh, says the Prime Minister, is she very devout and full of good works? No, she's the daughter of the Duke of Gloucester. How true, how sadly true. The marketplace, though, that Adam Smith is on about is where these exchanges take place to mutual advantage. Before Adam Smith came along and sort of formalized it, many believed that the trader who got the money won in the deal. Smith shows that this isn't necessarily true. We often refer to the things we need, food, etc., as goods. Not bads, goods. Things that are good for us. Food, shelter, and so forth. Adam Smith's thesis is that this exchange works for people, whether a person is a Christian or not, though with a proviso I will come to. That it's pretty vital for our daily lives as Christians, anyway, that we're only 5% of the people, so we've got to live in a world that is not particularly Christian. We live in and are part of a fallen world, but we cannot bail out and leave. Try and become self-sufficient. That's very fashionable amongst the Greens. Dare I say it, and again, in fact, happily, Michael has precursed me here. God has never intended for human beings to be self-sufficient, but to be interdependent. And this is as true morally, spiritually, and also materially. Again, this simple fact becomes illustrated by Adam Smith as he explores the amazing effects of specialization and the division of labor. Echoes of Paul and the body of Christ. Not all this, not all prophets, not all speaking in tongues, not all evangelists. We all have different things to contribute. Here is Adam Smith. The woolen coat, for example, which covers the day laborer, coarse and rough as it may appear, is the product of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber, or carder, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, and many others all join their different arts in order to complete this homely production. We are all interdependent, even at that level. And here again, Adam Smith, one of his famous quotes. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. You rear animals for meat. I grow vegetables. If we are not interdependent, you just eat meat, I just get to eat vegetables. However, if we trade meat for vegetables, we can both sit down to a Sunday lunch of meat and 2 veg. We both gain. That's trade. Money, that clever invention, just enables this kind of trade to work efficiently. Thus, a hungry tailor no longer has to search out a naked baker if the tailor wants a loaf of bread. Money makes it possible to spread this around and make life so much easier. At first, some of this sounds a bit self-centered, but in fact it's not. It's the most obviously sensible way in which material things we need, food, clothing, housing, etc., are obtained by exchange. And his crucial point is that things like wages, prices, supply and demand, and the apparent complexity of working these matters out is best left alone to what one might call the natural forces of competition and the marketplace. This may seem a bit brutal, but actually it works. Let me make a comparison which have all kinds of vibes, but it's perhaps useful. Compare, say, a supermarket with a government-run organization. Okay, you may not like supermarkets much, but one thing is obvious, that the supermarket supplies the customers with what they need, with remarkable efficiency, with relatively little waste, meeting the trends of shoppers' fashions very quickly, having no room, dare I say it, for employees who do not work. Need I say more? What government organization achieves this? None that I know of. And the good or service that they may or may not produce, if you're lucky, is usually second-rate at best. Yes, things do go wrong with supermarkets getting too big, over-dominate the market and become corporatist. I'll come to that. But that's because Adam Smith's principles are not being applied. In a fallen world, the free market in goods, services, and labor gives the optimum result for everyone. It is designed to do that, not by man, but by the Logos, by God, because the free market depends on something above and beyond it, the law which comes from God, from outside. The law that expects honesty in dealing, the respect for property, the freedom in ownership, and the right for a laborer to have his wages. The Old Testament law has 10 commandments and various other vital laws about these things. Law about honest scales, law about debts, law about thefts, law about property. Lawlessness prevents any markets working. If someone simply takes by force what should be traded, or enslaves people to work for nothing, as the Romans did, for example, God's laws are broken and the free market cannot work. Thus, Adam Smith was anti-slavery, both for obvious moral reasons from his perspective and also for free market reasons. It makes no sense to enslave a worker who works unwillingly for nothing. But the trouble is, control and oppression of markets is what we are now beginning to see in the West. That's why I told you the East has discovered what we are jettisoning very quickly. Command economies are the economies of tyranny. And sadly, more and more Western economies are stealthily or steadily becoming command economies. Crippling taxes, crippling regulations, government employment, which consumes wealth and does not create it. Did you know that current rates of taxation, even in the UK, and we are by no means the worst in the West, would actually have seemed intolerable to our forefathers, even under the tyrannies of Spain or France? For a moment, go back to John Cooperthwaite in Hong Kong. His rule was minimal regulation, low taxation for the rich, and none for the poor. Result? Hong Kong is the most incredibly rich city in the world. Its tax take is huge because the taxes are low, but the wealth is great. Set people free, and you'll get the taxes that you may want. Government should heed an invisible notice regarding all markets. Keep out. Now, to the main theme. I'm just a sort of kind of introductory bit, really, but I will get there in the end. The godlessness of the single market. Back to Mrs. Thatcher again, I repeat. I think back to many discussions in my early life where we all agreed that if you try to take the fruits of Christianity without its roots, the fruits will wither, and they will not come again unless you nurture the roots. But we must not profess the Christian faith and go to church simply because we want social reforms and benefits or better standard of behavior, but because we accept the sanctity of life, the responsibility that comes with freedom, and the supreme sacrifice of Christ, expressed so well in the hymn, "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." Again, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Bypass the cross, short-circuit the gospel, and there's a disastrous error. The West is doing it in a secular way, and dare I say it, the prosperity gospel of the TV evangelist does it in a pseudo-spiritual way. Other things being equal, and I'm afraid they often are not, living for Christ in the world does often have prosperity as a byproduct. Look at the Anabaptist groups that went to America and flourished to escape persecution. Similarly, the Quakers, the Huguenots, and the Methodists. Sobriety and hard work does result in prosperity. It's bound to, as it did indeed for the monasteries in the medieval period, who perhaps started a lot of this, though things went wrong. But this withering of the fruits that Mrs. Thatcher mentioned is just what is happening in the West and in the EU. They think they can have the fruits delivered to us by Christianity and reject Christianity. To make our own laws which are not in harmony with the Logos, who said, "If you love me, you will obey my commands." Contrast the modernistic attitude with the attitude expressed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Who's a fan? Yeah, we got some fans. Give it to him. Who, of course, was probably the greatest engineer, humanly speaking, that the world has ever seen. and I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but perhaps I hope it's somewhat true, partly fulfilled one of Jesus' most difficult sayings. When Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what is done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea.'" Well, maybe it's a bit oblique to suggest that the extraordinary engineering achievements of Brunel, which in a sense was through his faith, enabled these things to happen. The greatest world engineer the world has ever seen, transformed the 19th century and the 20th with these bold and brilliant engineering feats, railways, bridges, tunnels, ships, harbors, you name it. Yes, he had his failures, but throughout it, he had an interesting attitude, which he recalls in his own journal, and I quote, "Whenever I think seriously, it appears to me how ridiculously unimportant every worldly occurrence is, and how painful it will be to see every event pass off unheeded. Time flies, our hopes are gratified or blasted, and there is nothing to rest a permanent idea or hope on, but our prospects in the next world." That's Brunel. He had that Christian ethos. Yes, he was the boldest man in engineering, perhaps we have seen, along with Stevenson and others, but they had this rooted Christianity in there. This was a man who knew how to work in this world with an eye to eternity. Here he is again, writing much later in his life, probably his last year of life, to his own son, Isambard, just after the massive Great Eastern, 28,500 tons for your information, had just been successfully finally floated off the slipway on the Isle of Dogs. He writes this, "Finally, let me impress upon you the advantage of prayer. I am not prepared to say that the prayers of individuals can always be separately and individually granted. That would seem to be incompatible with the regular movements of the mechanism of the universe. And it would seem impossible to explain why prayer should now be granted and now refused. But this I can assure you, that I have ever, in my difficulties, prayed fervently, and that in the end my prayers have been, or have appeared to me to be, granted, and I have received great comfort." The greatest engineer the 19th century has ever seen was also a man who was prepared to pray about these things. There was a hesitant humility there to allow that God could even answer particular prayers, let us say, about the Great Eastern, which was stuck on its slipway. But he was prepared to pray. A man of science, a man of engineering, a man of enormous imagination, but also, intriguingly, a man of prayer. Here's Mrs. Thatcher again in her address to the Scottish Assembly. I'm just going to cut this bit short. "But there is little hope for democracy," back to the "if the hearts of men and women in democratic societies cannot be touched by a call to something greater than themselves. Political structures, state institutions, collective ideals, these are not enough. We parliamentarians can legislate for the rule of law. You," she said, "the church, can teach the life of faith. And when all is said and done, the politician's role is a humble one. You," she said to that church, "can teach the life of faith. And oh, how the established churches failed. Instead of preaching the gospel, which is what she wanted and expected them to do as Christians, what did they do? They carped." The EU talks about a level playing field. This is often mistaken for a free market. It is not. It's the opposite of a free market. In fact, Adam Smith would be spinning in his grave if he hadn't got better things to do. Here is Adam Smith again. For him, regulation by governments was anathema to its free operation. Here he goes. "The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order of people," by which he means bureaucrats, "ought always to be listened to with great precaution and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it." He could have described Brussels to a T with that. Throughout this, remember that what they are doing is imposing man's laws where God's laws, if left to run their course, would work. Jesus said, "You have let go the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men." And he said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is korban,' that is gifted, devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and mother." That's an instance. Jesus had a lot to say on those lines. Wealth in a free market is generated precisely because the playing field is not level. I'll repeat that. Wealth in a free market is generated precisely because the playing fields are not level. That is the fundamental point of competitive advantage. I can grow my meat, you can grow your vegetables because you have better soil, I have better pasture. That is a difference. That is why it works. If you try and make the vegetable man grow on the hillside and the hillside man grow where the vegetables are, it doesn't work. That's a level playing field. I have a physicist's mind, or a thermodynamic mind, and I say that just as you cannot get work out of two bodies in thermal equilibrium, you cannot get wealth out of a level playing field. That'd be a bit obscure if you're not a scientist. If level playing fields are bad for real business and real free market, they are nonetheless good for big corporates and statist monopolies operating in a customs union, which we know the European Union is. I won't go into the details of it. We know it is a customs union. It's following the pattern of Bismarck, and then in the pattern, I have to say this, I know it's considered what's its law, you're not allowed to mention them, but the Nazis planned exactly the same European economic community. Edward Spalton's got something coming out, the papers of the Third Reich economists setting it all up. The EU is following in these footsteps. These businesses are by default sclerotic and essentially lazy. They are like the revered redwood forests in America that suck the life out of everything. They are, in fact, I say this not very respectfully, huge weeds. They need to fall down. That's what nature would do, and replace them. No, they're preserved. And so they suck the life out of the soil. They get too big. Big corporates and statist economies have carved out their place in the sun, and their boards and shareholders sit back to enjoy their income. To put it crudely, they have become rent seekers. In a free market, such dinosaurs would have rings run round them by innovative new enterprises, which is the whole point of Adam Smith. But they cannot get started where regulation is so heavy. It's easy for the statist corporations to deal with regulation. They invent them. They pass them on to the Commission, and the Commission pass them. That keeps them in their wealthy and lazy position. But, and here's the interesting thing, the EU trade barriers imposed through tariffs and regulation so that goods from abroad, from outside the EU, find it difficult to get in because they are both often cheaper and often far better made, have come pouring in nonetheless. And this is alarming them in Brussels, because capitalism will find a way. So they had a cunning plan. And this cunning plan, and I touch on one of my other things here very quickly, is that by investing in the global warming theory, they can put up huge new barriers to those enterprising third world countries, the BRICS that we talk about. If you can force them to pay high price for energy, which is vital for wealth creation, then they are in business in terms of cutting off the flow of the wealth from the BRICS. Through the moral imperative, as they see it, of saving the planet from dire consequences of burning fossil fuels, the EU hoped it could hobble the burgeoning industries of the BRICS. Make the world's energy extremely expensive, and you're well on the way to achieving it. In passing, and in brackets, notice that in the USA, its labor force and labor has suddenly become competitive because its energy prices have at least halved just in the last few years through shale discoveries and shale gas. Interestingly, in the USA, respect for private property allows owners to exploit the oil or gas under their land. Unfortunately, in the UK, all that is state-owned. So the farmer who wishes to exploit shale under his ground gets just whatever little crumbs are thrown to it by the government. I guess it was since nationalisation of coal in the 1940s, but I may be wrong there. So shale in this country, I fear, will take forever to be exploited. Nonetheless, this great scheme of the EU is, to coin a phrase, a heffalump trap. They have actually successfully fallen into it. In its bid to save the corporates from disaster, it clasped the fantasy of global warming to its bosom, which gave them kudos amongst the large and powerful motley crew of green politicians, green NGOs and lobby groups, to whom Stanley Baldwin's words apply very aptly, quote, enjoying the privilege of the harlot down the ages, power without responsibility. Unfortunately, aside from those within its power, such as the UK, no country outside the EU pays any attention to the issue of global warming, and very sensibly too. And in fact, they have benefited and even profiteered by the EU's apparent gullibility and desire to commit economic suicide. The result is escalating energy prices in the EU, which you all know about, and its industry migrating to countries outside the EU where energy is cheaper. The very opposite of what they hope to achieve, of course. Germany, for example, is now facing an industrial energy crisis of staggering proportions. I don't know how long they'll survive it. The EU spends money like water on combating climate change. This all sounds pretty alarming, but I want to remind you of the story of David slaying Goliath. As you know, 1 Samuel 17. I'm going to read the story. I hope you're all familiar. If you remember, out every day stood Goliath, challenging the armies of Israel, the armies of Saul, to a single combat to settle the day. When David sees this and hears the insults being poured on God's armies, he says he'll have a try. First of all, what do? They say, look, here's some kit. No, here's some armor. And of course, he can't be doing with that. And what do we know? We know that he just takes his sling and 5 stones from the brook, and within minutes, Goliath is dead. Did you know Goliath never had a chance? He hadn't a chance. Again, to quote the Hitchhiker's Guide, he hadn't a Welk's chance in a supernova. He was a dead man walking. David, in rejecting armor, simply changed the rules of engagement, or rather he returned to rules he'd learned on the job as a shepherd, dealing with far more fearsome foes than Goliath, the bear and the lion. Goliath was actually a semi-invalid, suffering from agromegaly, which is a very unpleasant condition, whereby the pituitary gland has a tumor in it which prevents it stopping growth. Bone and tissue just go on growing in someone with this condition. Of course, they get very big. But it has all kinds of medical effects. One not least is to affect vision, often giving the sufferer double vision. Note what Goliath says to David. You come to me with sticks. David only had 1. He was seeing 2, poor old Goliath. He had to be led out by his armor bearer. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known where to go. He calls for David to come to him. Oh, why should he? He has no need. He's got a slingshot, which was deadly at a distance. Some have calculated that the force of impact of that slingshot was not far from that of a bullet from a Colt 45. Goliath hadn't a hope. So take heed. We may feel like little Davids with a huge Goliath facing us in the European Union, but it is sick. Sick spiritually, sick morally, and sick economically. It is growing in the wrong way, poor thing. It is trying to expand in order to increase its wealth, but all it's doing is reducing its wealth and thinning it out, like the old Roman Empire. Let's take comfort in that. This great giant of the EU, so apparently strong and unassailable, is, as I said, sick and crippled. It suffers from acromegaly, inappropriate and dangerous growth. I'm going to end with an epilogue from a book by Rodney Stark, which I also commend to you. It's well worth reading. It's called The Victory of Reason. And he ends like this. The modern world arose only in Christian societies, not in Islam, not in Asia, not in secular society. There haven't been any. And all the modernization that has since occurred outside Christendom was imported from the West, often brought by colonizers and missionaries. Even so, many apostles of modernization assume that, given the existing Western example, similar progress can be achieved today not only without Christianity, but even without freedom or capitalism, that globalization will fully spread scientific, technical, and commercial knowledge without any need to recreate the social or cultural conditions that first produced it. When the communists took power in China in 1949, there were perhaps 2 million Christians in China. At the time, not only Marxists, but even American liberal church leaders dismissed these Christians as merely rice Christians, people who put up with missionary efforts only in exchange for handouts. 50 years later, we have discovered that these Chinese rice Christians were so insincere that they endured decades of draconian repression and persecution, during which their numbers doubled again and again. There might be as many as 100 million Christians in China today. Moreover, conversion to Christianity is concentrated not amongst the peasants and the poor, but amongst the best educated, most modern Chinese. There are many reasons people embrace Christianity, including its capacity to sustain deep emotional and existentially satisfying faith. But another significant factor is its appeal to reason and the fact that it is so inseparably linked to the rise of Western civilization. For many non-Europeans, becoming a Christian is intrinsic to becoming modern. When have you heard that at a sermon? Thus, it is quite plausible that Christianity remains an essential element in the globalization of modernity. Consider this recent statement by one of China's leading scholars, quote, "One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West over all the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity." This is a Chinese academic scholar brought up with Mao Zedong. Christianity, that is why the West is so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. End quote. Thank you.